Section 24 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 2, Part 3. Henry gave his assent to the bill of attainder against his young, beautiful, and once adored consort, Catherine Howard, the Lady Rochford, Thomas Culpepper, and Francis Durham, the next day. The severed heads of these gentlemen had been, for the last 2 months, withering on London Bridge, so to them the sentence was immaterial. Notwithstanding the deceitful assurances of the royal grace that had been held out to the aged Duchess of Norfolk by Wriothesley, for the purpose of beguiling her, if possible, into becoming a witness against her granddaughter, the queen, she was included in the act of attainder, for Henry was resolutely bent on taking her life. He maintained that the offence of breaking open Durham's coffers and destroying the papers she took from thence was sufficient evidence of the crime of high treason. The judges, compliant as they were in most cases, had in this instance ventured to dissent from his majesty, as it was impossible to ascertain of what nature those papers were. Henry was irritated at the opinion of his law officers, and said, that there was as much reason to convict the Duchess of Norfolk of treason as there had been to convict Durham. They cannot say, he observes, that they have any learning to maintain that they have a better ground to make Durham's case treason, and to suppose that his coming again to the queen's service was to an ill intent of the renovation of his former naughty life, than they have in this case to presume that the breaking open of the coffers was to the intent to conceal letters of treason. Thus we learn from the highest possible authority that Durham suffered on presumptive evidence only, not that he had wronged the sovereign, but that he had conceived an intention to do so. This appears, in fact, to be the state rule of the case with regard to Durham. The Lord Chancellor produced the bill, with the royal seal and the king's signed manual, in the House of Lords, and desired the Commons might attend. The king was not present. The Duke of Suffolk then rose and stated, that he and his fellow deputies had been with the queen, and that she had openly confessed to them the great crime of which she had been guilty against the most high God and a kind prince, and lastly against the whole English nation, that she begged of them all to implore his majesty not to impute her crime to her whole kindred and family, but that his majesty would extend his unbounded mercy and benevolence to all her brothers, that they might not suffer for her faults. Lastly, she besought his majesty that it would please him to bestow some of her clothes on those maidservants who had been with her from the time of her marriage, since she had now nothing else left, to recompense them as they deserved. The Earl of Southampton next rose up, and confirmed what the duke said, but added something that had been obliterated from the journals of that day's proceedings, which, it is conjectured, was done to prevent posterity from learning some facts connected with the fate of the Howard queen. When the Commons entered, the assent of the king to the bill was given by commission, and the fatal sentence, Le roi l'a vu, was pronounced to the act which deprived a queen of England of her life without trial, and loaded her memory with obloquies so dark a hue that no historian has ventured to raise the veil, even to inquire how far the charges are based on fact. The persons who went with the Duke of Suffolk to receive the confession of the queen were those by whom she had been first accused to the king, namely, Cranmer, Southampton, Audley, and Thirlby. How much she confessed to them, says Burnet, is not clear, neither by the journal nor the Act of Parliament, which only says she confessed. If she had confessed the crime of adultery, there can be no doubt that the act of attainder would have been based on her own admission, instead of a presumption that it was her intention to commit that crime. The confession, mentioned in general terms by Suffolk, was evidently her penitent acknowledgment of her incontinence before her marriage with the king. No one, indeed, appears ever to have felt deeper contrition for the offences of her youth than this unhappy queen. When she was informed that she must prepare for death, she addressed her confessor, Dr. Longland, Bishop of Lincoln, in these words, which were afterwards delivered by him to a noble young lord of her name and near alliance. As to the act, my reverend lord, for which I stand condemned, God and his holy angels I take to witness, upon my soul's salvation, that I die guiltless, never having so abused my sovereign's bed. What other sins and follies of youth I have committed I will not excuse, but I am assured that for them God hath brought this punishment upon me, and will, in his mercy, remit them, for which, I pray you, pray with me unto his Son and my Saviour, Christ. Cranmer had humanely tried, by every means in his power, to induce Katharine to preserve her life by acknowledging a precontract with Francis Derham. But she repelled the idea with scorn, and, with the characteristic firmness of a Howard, determined rather to go to the block as Queen of England than to prolong her dishonoured existence on the terms suggested. The Church of Rome allowed no divorce except in cases of precontract, and, as Katharine would not admit that she was troth-plight to Francis Derham, there was no other mode of severing Henry's matrimonial engagement with her than by the axe of the executioner. The only person against whom she testified resentment was her uncle Norfolk, who, in a letter to the council, written when he, in his turn, lay under sentence of death in the Tower, thus expresses himself of her and Anne Boleyn. What malice both my nieces that it pleased the king's highness to marry did bear unto me is not unknown to such ladies as kept them in this house, as my lady Herbert, my lady Tyrwhitt, my lady Kingston, and others, which heard what they said of me. In the same letter the duke shows sufficient cause for the indignation expressed by the unhappy Katharine against him, for his unmanly conduct to the unfortunate ladies of his family in their distress, since he boasts that he was the principal witness against the poor old duchess, his father's widow, saying, "Who showed his majesty the words of my mother-in-law, for which she was attainted of misprision, but only I?" Katharine, when she vented the natural feelings of contempt and bitterness against her cruel uncle, had every reason to believe that her aged grandmother would follow her to the block, as she then lay under sentence of death in the Tower. Who can wonder that she regarded Norfolk with horror? The interval allowed to the unqueen Katharine Howard between her condemnation and the execution of her sentence was brief. More time to prepare for the awful change from life to eternity would have been granted to the lowest criminal who should have been found guilty by the laws of his country than was allotted to her who had shared the throne of the sovereign. The royal assent to her attainder was signified to her February 11th, but 2 days after she was led to the scaffold, accompanied by Lady Rochford and attended by her confessor. But Katharine Howard, though still in the morning of life and the bloom of beauty, was already weaned from the world. She had proved the vanity of all its delusions and the deceitfulness of royal favour. She had been more sternly dealt with by historians than Anne Boleyn, but she met her fate with more calmness, and a far greater degree of pious resignation. Familiarized as the people now were with the sight of blood, observes Tytler, it was not without some feelings of national abasement that they beheld another queen ignominiously led to the scaffold. And that, we may add, to die, not according to the law, but in defiance of the laws of England, which have provided, for the security of human life, that no one should be put to death without a fair and open trial. Frivolous as were the evidences on which Anne Boleyn was condemned, she was allowed the privilege of speaking for herself. Her wit, her acuteness, and impassioned eloquence, if heard with callous indifference by her partial judges, have pleaded her cause to all posterity. They plead for her still. Katharine Howard was led like a sheep to the slaughter, without being permitted to unclose her lips in her own defence, save for her spiritual adviser, who was to receive her last confession. This prelate, be it remembered, was also the king's confessor, the same whom he had required upon All Saints' Day to unite with him in thanking God for having blessed him with such a wife. More sympathy would in all probability have been manifested for the young, the beautiful, and deeply penitent queen, if she had had any other companion on the scaffold than the infamous Lady Rochford, whose conduct in regard to her accomplished husband and Anne Boleyn had rendered her an object of general execration. Katharine Howard submitted to the headsman's stroke with meekness and courage, and her more guilty companion imitated her humility and piety in the closing scene of their fearful tragedy. The particulars, as described in a contemporary letter from an eye-witness, are as follows. Otwell Johnson to his brother, John Johnson, merchant of the Staple at Calais. At London, 15th of February, 1541-42. From Calais I have heard as yet nothing of your suit to my Lord Grey, and for news from hence, I saw the Queen and the Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following my letter on Sunday evening, whose souls, I doubt not, be with God, for they made the most godly and Christian end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, and with godly words and steadfast countenances, they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment of death for their offences against God heinously, from their youth upwards, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously, wherefore they being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and parliament, required the people, I say, to take example at them, for amendment of ungodly lives, and to gladly obey the king in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people so to do, commending their souls to God, and earnestly calling upon him for mercy, whom I beseech to give us such grace, with faith, hope, and charity, at our departing out of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his Godhead in joy everlasting. Amen. Your loving brother, Otwell Johnson. With my hearty commendations unto Mr. Cave and Mrs. Cave, not forgetting my sister your wife, I pray you to let them be made partakers of this last news, for surely it is well worth the knowledge. That doubts were entertained of the guilt of this unhappy queen may be gathered from the misgivings of the Lord Chancellor after the first reading of the bill for her attainder, and also from the following contemporary notice among the Lambeth manuscripts. This day, February 13th, was executed Queen Katharine for many shocking misdemeanours, though some do suppose her to be innocent. The last words of Lady Rochford were, that she supposed God had permitted her to suffer this shameful doom as a punishment for having contributed to her husband's death by her false accusation of Queen Anne Boleyn, but she was guilty of no other crime. This declaration was made on the scaffold, probably after she had seen the head of her royal mistress severed by the axe of the executioner. If urged by conscience at that dreadful moment to acknowledge the guilt of perjury and murder, she would scarcely have marred her dying confession by falsely protesting her innocence of the more venial offences for which she had been sentenced to die with the queen. The scaffold on which Katharine Howard and Lady Rochford suffered was the same on which Anne Boleyn, Lord Rochford, the Marquess of Exeter, and the venerable Countess of Salisbury had been previously executed. It was erected within the Tower, on the space before the church of St. Peter ad Vincula. It has been long since removed, but its site may still be traced by the indelible stains on the flints, which faintly map out the dimensions of the fatal spot where so much royal and noble blood was spilt by the headsman's axe during the Tudor reigns of terror. Thus died in the flower of her age, and in the 18th month of her marriage, Queen Katharine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII, and the second queen whom he had sent to the block, after repudiating a lawful wife to obtain her hand. In both instances it might be said, the beauteous toy, so fiercely sought, had lost its charms by being caught. Henry's motives for marrying Katharine Howard are explained in a letter from the Privy Council to Mr. Paget, his ambassador in France, in the following words. It pleased his highness, upon a notable appearance of honour, cleanness, and maidenly behaviour, to bend his affection towards Mrs. Katharine Howard, daughter to the Lord Edmund Howard, brother to me, the Duke of Norfolk, insomuch that his highness was finally contented to honour her with his marriage, thinking now in his old age, after sundry troubles of mind which had happened unto him by marriages, to have obtained such a perfect jewel of womanhood, and very perfect love to him, as should have not only been to his quietness, but also brought forth the desired fruit of marriage, like as the whole realm thought semblable, and did her all honour accordingly. In the act of settlement of the succession, the imaginary children, which Henry expected his fair young consort to bring him, were given the preference to his disinherited daughters by his two first queens. Catherine Howard, like her cousin Anne Boleyn, probably fared the worse for not having fulfilled the royal tyrant's wish of male offspring. Give me children or die, appears to have been the fearful alternative offered by Henry to his queens. Henry VIII. Assumed the title of King of Ireland a few days before the execution of his fifth consort. Catherine Howard therefore died the first queen of England and Ireland. The mangled form of the once adored Catherine Howard was borne from the bloody scaffold to a dishonoured grave with indecent haste, and with no more regard to funereal obsequies than had been vouchsafed to her equally unfortunate cousin, the murdered Anne Boleyn, near whose ostensible place of burial her remains were interred. Weaver gives the following record of her grave. In St. Peter's Chapel of the Tower, very near the relics of Anne Boleyn, lieth the interred body of Catherine, the fifth wife of Henry VIII., the daughter of Edmund, and niece to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. It is verily believed, and many strong reasons are given both by English and foreign writers, that neither this Queen Catherine nor Queen Anne were any way guilty of the breach of matrimony whereof they were accused. If all the patterns of a merciless tyrant had been lost to the world, says Sir Walter Raleigh, when speaking of Henry VIII., they might have been found in this prince. Henry VIII. Was the first king of England who brought ladies to the block, who caused the tender female form to be distorted with tortures, and committed a living prey to the flames. He was the only king who sought consolation for the imagined offences of his wives against his honour by plundering their relatives of their plate and money. Shame, not humanity, prevented him from staining the scaffold with the blood of the aged Duchess of Norfolk. He released her after long imprisonment. George Cavendish introduces the sorrowful shade of the unfortunate Howard Queen among his metrical visions. A few lines may bear quotation. As written by her contemporary, they are very curious. Thus as I sat, the tears within my eyne, of her the wrecked, whiles I did debate, before my face methought I saw this queen, no whit, as her I left, God wot, of late. But all bewept, in black and poor estate, which prayed me that I would ne forget the fall of her within my book to set. Notwithstanding the rudeness of the measure, there is something very pathetic in the piteous imagery of the fallen queen, all bewept, in black and poor estate, petitioning for her place in the melancholy train of contemporary victims of the shadowy dramatis persona of George Cavendish's book is made up. She is not much beholden to his report after all, for he violates history by making her confess that which she denied before God and his holy angels, namely, violation of her marriage vows. Cavendish speaks of her as very young and extols her great beauty, which he makes her lament as the occasion of her fall. To be a queen fortune did me prefer, flourishing in youth with beauty fresh and pure, whom nature made shine equal with the stars, and to reign in felicity with joy and pleasure, wanting no thing that love might me procure, so much far beloved, far beyond the rest, with my sovereign lord, who lodged me in his nest. Our poet makes the young queen bewail her loss of the royal obsequies, and that no one would wear mourning for her, in the following quaint lines. Now I know well, quod she, among my friends all, that here I left the day of my decay, that I shall get no pompous funeral, nor of my black no man the charge shall pay, save that some one perchance may hap to say, such one there was, alas, and that there was Ruth, pity, that she herself disdained with such untruth. Culpeper is also compelled by our poet to make a ghostly confession of a crime there is no evidence to believe he ever committed, and which he denied on the rack and on the scaffold. It is however to be observed That Cavendish makes all Henry's victims suffer justly, except the Countess of Salisbury, though the view he has taken of both Catherine Howard and her predecessor, Anne Boleyn, is afterwards contradicted very fully, by the admission he describes Henry as making in the midst of his deathbed remorse. After I forsook my first most lawful wife, and took another, my pleasure to fulfil, I changed often, so inconstant was my life. Death was the meed of some that did none ill, which only was to satisfy my will, I was so desirous of new. A high tribute to the virtues of Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, follows. It was in consequence of the discovery of Catherine Howard's early misconduct that the memorable Act of Parliament was passed, making it high treason for any person to know of a flaw in the character of any lady whom the king might propose to marry without revealing it, and also subjecting the lady to the penalty of death if she presumed to deceive her sovereign on that point. Nicander Nucius, a Greek attaché of the imperial ambassador at the court of Henry VIII. In the year 1546, tells us that Catherine Howard, whom he places as the fourth instead of the fifth in his catalogue of Henry's wives, was esteemed the most beautiful woman of her time. He records her tragic fate, but has so little idea of the real state of the facts that he says, "She had fallen in love with a noble youth of the court, and the king himself detected their guilt, and commanded their heads to be cut off with those who were the accessories to their passion, and the heads, except that of the queen, he caused to be elevated on spears, and fixed on one of the turrets of the bridge, and the skulls are even at this time to be seen denuded of flesh." A strange confusion of truth and falsehood pervades this statement, but it is curious, because from the pen of a contemporary, and denoting the precise spot occupied by the heads of Culpeper and Durham. These Nicander had himself seen. His ignorance of the English language caused him to make a few mistakes in the history attached to these ghastly relics of the royal matrimonial tragedy which occurred in 1541 42. End of Section 24. End of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elizabeth Strickland.